Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to UCL for those of you who are not UCL staff students. For those of you who are alumni, welcome back. Colleagues, all of you are very welcome. I'm Jackie Glass. I'm the Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Professor Tristan Smith. I'm just going to say a few words, and then we're going to hear from Tristan. We have Harry here from IMO, and Harry is going to relax for a little while, and then he is going to play a part in the proceedings this evening as well. And we'll have time for questions and answers, everybody. So please do have a think about what questions you would like to ask. So, Tristan, you are Professor of Energy and Transport in part of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, which is BZIR, and the Energy Institute. And like many people in UCL and in our faculty, you have traversed between disciplines, you have traversed subject areas, and you started your career as an engineer and naval architect. You've been at UCL for a number of years. You got your PhD in 2009, but very great congratulations to you. Most recently, you were made a professor, and that is why we are all here this evening to celebrate that. Also, like many people at UCL, the things that drive your work is a concern for environment. And what I see in your work is that you have an incredibly strong voice for change. You are an amazing advocate for change. You are bringing science and policy and impact together, and I know that you're going to explore a whole range of topics in your presentation this evening. The thing that I particularly admire about the work that you're doing is this constant attention to both technical and operational, industry and research, spanning these things to make change possible. And that's really powerful position. It's also not easy, right? And so actually getting pathways to change that will work is hard work to do. So I'm very grateful to you for the work that you've done over the years. I'm not going to introduce Harry just at the minute. We'll do that in a few moments' time. But Tristan, this is a celebratory moment for you as a professor, but it's also an opportunity for you to profess and for you to challenge us to go further. So you talked about transitions in your work, you've talked about pathways. I'm really excited for what we're going to hear this evening, and I'm also excited for the years ahead of the work that you're going to do. I'm so pleased that you've got such a wonderful network through the colleagues that you have through the IMO, and I know you're going to be reflecting on that this evening as well. So without further ado, everybody, would you please welcome Professor Tristan Smith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. This is very exciting. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and giving me some support here. I am quite nervous. I do a lot of speaking in front of people, so I'm surprised at how nervous I am. But someone did tell me earlier today that it's not normally practice to de-promote someone after they've done this, and so maybe that's something, but I guess there's always a first. But thank you genuinely for everyone who's come along this evening. I want to start by, sorry, this is not all going to be nostalgia, but I want to start with a little bit of nostalgia, and this is with thanks to Mark Barrett, who sent me the email when he saw this talk, coming up with a photo, because he's like an official photographer within the Energy Institute. He's been taking pictures of everything that's happened there, and he had in his archives a picture that shows the 4 people who started the research group within the Energy Institute 15 years ago. Himself on the left, Nish, who I have the pleasure of co-leading the centre with now, Owen, Sophie, and myself, looking rather fresher faced and even smarter wearing a tie in those days. But that group of people are what I need to pay tribute to, because they were joined over the years by about another 30 people who are what has enabled me personally to do the work that I do. This is not the work of one person or the celebration of one person's professorship. This is the effort of an enormous number of people working many human hours over the last 30 years, 15 years. I've not been quite so long, over the last 15 years. And that's the key that I wanted to start with. And I'm going to use that timeline again just to talk about some of the key points within that 15 years of history that we've been through as a group and how we've tried to think about this subject of shipping decarbonisation, which leads a bit into the story I want to tell about the IMO. So the first is that these are key reports. We did a lot of academic publishing as well. I know some people don't believe we publish as much as we could do, but these are the kind of key seminal reports where those different journal and conference proceedings that we were working on got pulled together into something that had an impact in the world beyond academic publication. And so the first one was some work that we were commissioned by the IEA back in 2013, who were trying to get a handle on what the shipping sector's energy use was and its decarbonisation pathway. So they approached our group and said, we think you've probably got some good data. Can we harvest it into our model? And that was the start of our sort of engineering approach to thinking about this sector. It was built on when we were asked and successfully bid for work for the IMO Secretariat themselves to do something called the third IMO greenhouse gas study in 2014. That was quite a seminal moment. It moved us into a higher profile of work, certainly within the IMO, but also within the community more internationally, and was followed by work that we did with Catherine Palmer and the team at Lloyd's Register in the mid-2010s on a series of publications that we called Zero Emission Vessels 2030, thinking about the steps that we would need if we wanted to see zero emission ships on the water in that time frame. Further on from that, we started to do more thinking, which is more substantively about transition, and that's something that Jackie was referring to. So we moved from this more engineering, what does the engineering solution look like and what are its economics, often called sort of techno-economics, into something which was more socio-technical. And that was stimulated a lot by the community that I've been very fortunate to exist within the Energy Institute, because around me were some of the leading scholars on socio-technical transitions theory, transitions thinking, which led us to do a piece of work, or in collaboration with my colleagues, particularly Domagoj Bartchik, which was a study on the strategy for transition of the sector. And that started us thinking really about what are the levers for change beyond a crude assumption that there's going to be some policy. What does that change manifest as in practice? We then started to think more about wider subjects. So JET here, Why JET, was a seminal paper that Ali and Christian did in our group, published under the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. But that was the start of our foray into the questions that went beyond the engineering and beyond the economics and beyond the transition theory into this is now a question which needs to be thought about in terms of just an equitable transition. How do low-income countries in particular see something of benefit out of this transition? And then this emission reduction pathways returned us to more engineering, but it was a very detailed piece of work we did with the UK government. And then the last piece in the chain so far is something that I need to give my colleague Dola credit for, which is her engagement in Africa to try and look at what some of the African countries' risks and opportunities might be through a series of reports. And so we've kind of spread our evolution of our work over a long period of time. There are a couple of people I want to pay tribute through that process because I was strongly influenced by them and the challenges they gave me. The first is Tony de Bruym, who was at that time the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands and who was kind of given a challenge by several people as to why they were being so high ambition within the UNFCCC, within the COP process. Tony was a key advocate for a progressive outcome in the Paris climate negotiations, and the history on that are that he had a massive effect on those in terms of bringing in the 1.5 ambition. But he was also, coincidentally, the foreign minister of a country that was the third largest flag register in the world. The Marshall Islands, through various coincidences, opportunities and hazards, has this high status within the shipping industry, and he was aware of that but wasn't necessarily aware of everything that was going on in the IMO, and he started to dig in 2014, 2015 with lots of advisors, including Pete, who I'm very glad has come down today, to think about what needed to happen in the IMO, and he was a voice that drove change, challenging that organisation significantly in 2015 and enabling it to move from an organisation that said we don't see any role as our entity, as the International Maritime Organisation, a specialised UN agency responsible for shipping in greenhouse gas emission reductions. That was the statement of the Secretary General of that organisation in early 2015. But after Tony's intervention and various other things that started to happen, that changed, as we'll see in a second. The other person who's been really important in all of this is Joanna Christiansen, and that links back to something Jackie said as well. Johanna is the head of something called Global Maritime Forum, and she transitioned an organisation called Danish Maritime Days, which is a very Danish-centric discussion on what do we do about the future of the shipping industry. Denmark is a phenomenal country, as I'm sure many of you know, in terms of shipping. It's got so many of the big names. And she took upon herself to kind of transition that, and by doing so asked us for a lot of help on what the decarbonisation journey might look like. And so these two individuals gave us both political exposure as well as industry commercial exposure, and those have been seminal to our group's ability to kind of think through with inside knowledge and inside platform what was needed. But for now, I want to go back to this question of energy transition theory, because in 2021, when Domagoj and colleagues helped to write this report that I've just pointed to, it was the first time that we didn't look at this as a spreadsheet. It's the first time that we looked at this as something where there were forces, socio-technical forces, if you like, impinging on a regime. These are all kind of jargon that people in this discipline use in order to talk about the basic movement of something which currently is in a certain paradigm, in this case, large machinery that burn fossil fuels, into a future paradigm of zero emissions. And there are various ways of conceptualizing that and breaking it down, and several people often use this relationship, or a sigmoid curve or an S-curve, to describe a gradual change over time on the x-axis here, of a sector which needs to move from a certain paradigm through a phase of emergence, of adoption of new technology, into a diffusion phase where that starts to become more prominent and mass market, and then finally into something that we would recognise as reconfiguration. And having sort of laid out that theory, leaning very heavily on Frank Heales's work amongst others, the way that we conceptualised it for shipping was there are three ways in which that transition unfolds. The first option, scenario one, is where a strong lead country, and at that point in time we picked out China, Japan and EU, not really a country, but let's just give us a bit of latitude. A strong lead country initiates and drives a technology that becomes the future for everyone, and they kind of blast it through in a certain style of leadership. Another is where you have multiple countries simultaneously making progress and coincidentally heading through their own respective actions, not necessarily through collusion, to reach a state of transition, a state of the new paradigm of zero emissions. But the third option, and the one that is uniquely almost accessible to the shipping sector, is the one where we have a global regulator, in this case a UN specialised agency, the IMO, that is capable of setting rules that the global shipping system, every country, every ship, have to abide by. And we looked and broke these down, and in 2021, we were quite sanguine about the likelihood of scenario 3 materialising, because we'd been through what hadn't been a great success, something called short-term measures, in terms of a policy that was really going to drive change. And so there were already people nipping at the heels of the transition story coming from regional regulatory or national leadership perspectives. And we were trying to look at all of these fairly evenly handed, but that caught us by surprise. And this is where I want to try and move to what I'm cheesily referring to as a drama of 4 acts, of what happened then after our work in 21, because we were kind of laying it out as a hypothesis, but we were caught by surprise. And we were caught by surprise, as explained very clearly by this graph, or not. Let me walk you through it and see if I can make it clearer. This is a graphic I've stolen from Climate Action Tracker, who are an NGO that look at progress by individual countries, but also by organisations. So shipping, international shipping, is counted a bit like a country in their reporting, and they also evaluate whether the UK or Germany or Japan or whoever is doing good stuff in their NDC or not. And their calculation for the shipping sector is that we would expect to have the emissions in the blue wedge there. That's actually work that we've been involved in producing the calculations for, but they've used it and put it into their plot to say that the forecast emissions for shipping are to go up over time. But in 2023, having been told that they were highly insufficient by this vocal NGO, we then saw the adoption of these two purple lines, the purple solid line and the purple dotted line. The purple solid line is the minimum greenhouse gas emission reduction targets of 20 striving for 30%, which is the dotted line in 2030, as a reduction on the greenhouse gas emissions in 2008. Whereas in 2040, what the IMO adopted in its revised strategy was 70 striving for 80, and then a target of net zero emissions at or around 2050. So this organisation that we'd previously characterised as having one of a number of options for unfolding the transition suddenly moved in a step change of ambition to something much more aggressive. And to tell the next part of the story, I need to play you a short video clip which will feature the same guy that was in the opening credits. And apologies that the music or the sound is not louder. This is... So, just as you couldn't see him there, but Harry, who's here, sitting up here, is the chair of that meeting and is the recipient of this key that John is performing. So John Taikovi is a Ratuman, an island in Fiji, and he is performing something called a key, which is something that was actually written by one of his elders, and I need to try and get the name right. It's Gagaj Taimanav, who is the elder that did the composition for him for this specific meeting. And what he's expressing is a challenge to the IMO, both, as I understand it, it's a challenge to the IMO, both to move with Oceania and the countries that he represented in that little performance in terms of the fact that they were standing on very solid ground and weren't going anywhere, to get a much more eloquent description of what it is that he's describing. Please go and have a look at Christian's blog on this Anthropocene link at the bottom. But the point I'm trying to make here is that one of the reasons why the IMO had a step change was undeniably the leadership that this small group of countries from the Pacific Islands had in the IMO since 2015, building up a head of pressure which really converted in 2023 to an agreement that they refused to accept and be told by states like the United States or Germany or Europe. They refused to back down when those countries pressured them and said, no, this is the best deal we're going to get. They refused to accept that, and they kept pushing and pushing and got higher numbers on the behalf of everyone in society more generally, because they pushed the IMO to get that result, to get as close as they did to 1.5. The tragedy is they didn't get 1.5, but they pushed hard, and they were here at the subsequent meeting reminding everyone that they were still there and they would keep pushing. And that explains some of what happens in Act 2. So we then had a situation where that leadership in the Pacific countries started to build momentum for something they'd already laid the ground for in MEPC 76, a far earlier meeting, for a levy. And a levy is a concept where we charge a price on the greenhouse gas emissions of every single ship, and this was something they advocated for strongly throughout the period and became, in due course, joined by a number of other countries, setting up a tension in the IMO's debate about what policy it would use to implement and achieve those ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets. That tension existed because there were other countries, notably China, Brazil, but also a number of others, not so many. This is number of countries on the y-axis who were speaking out at this point in the negotiations at ISWG 17. So this had the majority. Here we had a noisy minority saying we want a different solution, we don't want a levy. But what we did also have at that point in time is a very large number of countries, more than 100. The IMO has 176 member states. So we had 70 odd actively participating, but 100 sitting on their hands, refusing to give a particular position. So this, as the discussion evolved, gave us a sense that not only was the Pacific now preparing and indeed leading the debate as we went into the discussion on measures, having already won and successfully increased ambition in the statement of ambition, we needed to see what they were going to do next. They were clearly building up quite a lot of pressure. But we were left, this is now in 2024, moving into early 2025. Over the period of late 24, those countries worked very closely, both with their fellow countries in Europe, but also with the industry, the International Chamber of Shipping, in order to try and further develop this concept of a levy. In the meantime, others were continuing to develop an alternative concept, which I've depicted here as a graph that shows a green ship, which is a ship below a certain threshold on greenhouse gas emissions, trading credits with a red ship. It's a complicated mechanism that involves money moving solely from one ship to another, i.e. from one industry actor to another, whereas the concept here generates revenue or money that flows into a central fund. And those two sides were pitting against each other with the huge efforts that were expended by the Pacific, Europe and others. They managed to build an unprecedented number of countries co-sponsoring a submission to the next meeting. This is ISWG 18, which took place in February in 2025 this year. And at that point, they had 50 countries co-sponsoring, but most importantly, the countries that they had on there included the three big flag states, Panama, Marshall Islands, Liberia, included big Asian countries like Japan that were important, both from an industry support, but also a geopolitical support, and included, obviously, a large number of countries. We estimated at the meeting itself that probably 60 countries were expressing pro-levy attitude at that point in time. But for reasons which we can go into lots further discussion on, the outcome of that meeting didn't resolve the tension between those two designs, and various actors, including Singapore, but also colluded with by European countries, moved to an alternative, completely different design of policy, which is referred to here as J9 because that's the name of the paper that introduced the concept, but is also referred to as two-tier. And here we have multiple bands expressing performance thresholds. A vessel which is below the lowest or highest performance threshold is the one that gets the credits, and vessels that are above that would be generating credits. They would be performing worse, and they would be paying to pollute, probably to the vessel here, in order to justify that poor performance. This mechanism is really hard to explain, but it's also incredibly hard to model. We really struggled over the next 2 months to find a really good computation that we could express to people what the consequences of that policy was. It was a classic bit of, apologies to lawyers in the room, of which I know there are a couple, lawyers designing policy, rather than someone who's going, well, what is the consequence of this to a commercial decision-making process? And the consequence of that was that we ended up with something which was very hard to explain any benefits to. It was a hybrid mess of a solution, and that led us, even though we succeeded in generating larger agreement around that concept, because it was the only one on the table when we came to make a decision in April, it led to Act 4. Not solely, but it was contributing to the fact that we ended up in this situation, which has now been quite widely reported. Here is a scene, again, Harry unfortunately is in the hot seats in this photograph. You can't quite see him. Well, I had a front row seat in terms of being in the room, but Harry was actually the chair of this meeting. And you can see a large number of angry delegates probably shouting at the Secretary General of the IMO, Arsenio Dominguez, as we went through some chaotic scenes of countries trying to figure out what was going on. Where were we actually going to have the debate that we'd all come for? What was the process that we were being driven through? Was there going to be a vote? When? Which vote? And the backstory to a lot of this is actually the behaviour significantly of the US administration. And so it's now been widely reported over the last 2 or 3 weeks since that event unfolded, which resulted in the deferment of a decision that should have been made this October for adoption on the net zero framework, on a whole package of greenhouse gas policy that would have unlocked significant investment into shipping. But due to that tactic used by the United States and also the behaviour of the Saudi Arabian government that were significantly disruptive in that decision, we ended up with this deferment and a state of uncertainty that now exists. And my next sort of puzzle, my next question to myself is, what do we do next? What's the role of academia? So we could talk about this in lots of different ways, but in tribute to Fergus, who's my son, who's very kindly come along today, I thought we could talk about it in a rather clumsy metaphor of Harry Potter. We don't need to speculate about who Voldemort is or what Voldemort represents here. It could be an individual, but it could also be a concept, which is something more nebulous like political will. We don't need to speculate who Harry, Hermione and Ron are in real life. The point is that there were two sides in this situation that we need to resolve. But I'd like to go a little bit deeper, so apologies to those who aren't super familiar with Harry Potter or haven't rewatched it recently as I have. But there are, within this story, the concept of Horcruxes, and those Horcruxes represent little bits of Voldemort's soul which he's managed to attach to different objects. And I'd like to try and use that as a way of communicating the challenge that we now have, which is that this ill will towards a progressive outcome at the IMO is now buried in lots of different potential spaces that need to be tackled. And arguably this has been the approach of the work that I and colleagues have been doing within the research group for several years now. We've been going, okay, what's stopping people from doing things? And let's target that and see if we can remove it as an obstacle. Well, that's exactly the kind of situation we're in now. Why did we not get adoption? What are the problems we're going to face when this comes back at some point in the future? And I've written some of them. This is not exhaustive. We've been trying to do a lot of analysis on why that US and Saudi push was successful. But some of them we think are expressed as doubt about shipping zero emissions technology pathway. What does the future look like is still a bit cloudy to many people. An unclear national or domestic opportunity. How do we really sell this to countries? What do they see as their upside? What are the real details that they're taking on? These things are coupled. What's the clarity of the risk that they face? How much will their costs increase as a result of action at the IMO? And the other one, which I think is notable, is shipping's IMO low political saliency in the majority of the West countries. What happened when Donald Trump and the Eye of Sauron, sorry, that's a different story, turned on the IMO process and the actors there, was that we ended up with not just Donald Trump, but also Rubio and various other states at Secretary of State level representatives, picking up the phone and calling heads of states in different countries. And there was no counter to that. The European community did not have Ursula von der Leyen or any equivalent individual picking up the phone to say to a country, we've heard you just had a call from Rubio telling you that you need to jump this, otherwise they're going to tariff you. Well, we think that you need to stand still and we're prepared to give you this support and we really value you standing by our side in this process. None of that happened. So there's a problem that we also need to address, which is beyond the realms of an academic, which is that there was a bit of a deficit of political saliency within a lot of our governments. So the ones that I want to concentrate on, because they're the ones that we've got some potential to work on in academia, are those that I've just bolded, and I'll step through them as quickly as possible so we can get Harry's reflections, because I think it's obviously becoming apparent, hopefully, in the room why this is one perspective, but this is something that needs to be digested in lots of different ways. So, sorry to go into some more of the engineering detail, but this is partly the puzzle here, is what do we see as the future? And there are multiple different options, which is one of the reasons why we have a challenge here. On the left-hand side here, we've got different feedstocks that you can make energy commodities out of. We can make them out of plants and animal waste. We can make them out of wind and solar energy. We can make it out of fossil fuels. If we make energy commodities that we use in the future out of fossil fuels, we'll have to do something called CCS, carbon capture and storage, suck the CO2 out of the exhaust and then bury it underground. And if we do that, we could make hydrogen. And using that hydrogen, sorry, that's not very legible text, but using that hydrogen, we could put it into something called the Haber-Bosch process, make ammonia, and that's quite an attractive fuel in our calculations in terms of being cost effective. The biofuel routes are also obviously very feasible. They're ongoing at the moment. And there are ways in which we can make more complex molecules, for example, methanol and alcohol or hydrocarbons out of those same processes. So there's an industrial chemical engineering process that goes beyond what we do at the moment, which is just pumping oil and gas out of the ground, but is entirely feasible. And we can estimate the cost of all of those things. And we can estimate the cost of modifying ships in order to run on those fuels. Here's a picture which I've stolen from BW, one of the big ship owner operators, of a vessel that they designed to run on ammonia. So within this space, within the last decade, we've seen a lot of work done to visualize what this means. And one of the contributions from our research has been to try and calculate the relative cost of operating on all of those different fuels. So here we've got a graph with time on the x-axis and total cost of operation on the y-axis. That TCO is a compound of both the capital costs of a more expensive vessel, but also the operating costs of running that ship on more expensive fuel. And you can see a range of different options. The colours correspond to different fuel technologies that ship has been designed to use. So imagine a vessel that had been designed to use a conventional oil, a diesel oil, which in shipping jargon, VLSFO, very low sulfur fuel oil, or bio-MGO, marine gas oil. These are all conventional fuels similar to those that you would see today, but they can be made by different production pathways. The grey lines correspond to something called LNG, liquid natural gas, which is a liquefied version of the natural gas that we pump out of the ground, which can also be produced by these different production pathways. Blue corresponds to that alcohol, methanol, red to ammonia. And what you can see in the graph, and this is simulating what would happen in our estimate under the net zero framework policy that was agreed in principle in April this year, you would start by having a reasonable competition between LNG and ammonia. But by the mid-30s, or towards the end of the 30s, there would be a clear breakaway winner as that policy became more stringent, specifically ammonia, as a pathway to achieve both the greenhouse gas intensity reductions of that policy, but also the least cost way of achieving that. And that outcome, we thought, was fairly clear, but we've managed to pick up quite a lot of doubt over the last 12 months on how this works in practice. Partly, I don't want to take credit for this, but this is a project in Saudi Arabia, the NEOM project, which is a $10 billion investment to produce about 1 million tonnes of green ammonia per annum. It's due to come online sometime later this decade. To give you a picture, I wanted to give you a kind of sense of what that graph meant in practice, because it means building one of these every month for the next 20 years, or starting one of them a month for the next 20 years. It's a huge infrastructure project. It's a huge capital investment. And that has led some people, including Michael Liebrich, who's a sort of famous discussant of this subject, to point to hydrogen as a concept being generally a bubble, and has been very successful in kind of pushing that forwards. Michael is is behind Bloomberg New Energy Finance. He really understands what he's talking about, both in engineering terms, but also in economic terms and finance, which is his background. So he's been a strong voice against this being a credible pathway. But we also have the biofuels lobby, which is a strong voice against it, as well as the nuclear lobby, which is now resurgent, and we're seeing a lot of evidence of people talking very favourably about putting nuclear reactors on ships. There's also the problem that ammonia as a chemical is hazardous. It's particularly corrosive, but it's also very damaging to human health. And so there's a whole host of safety and operational issues which give people a lot of reason to be doubtful. And then there's the reality of whether or not we can operate this, not just in Saudi Arabia in massive infrastructure projects, but also in all the countries which will need a decarbonisation solution. And I've used a graphic taken from Niue, an island in the Pacific, which has one example of some particularly low tech, in this case loading a container in order to get it onto a ship, but the same would be true for any sort of attempt to try and refuel or bunker the vessel. So there's research need still, I think, in that question of what's the future fuel. But there's also research need, in my opinion, as to what the commercial landscape now looks like, because there will be a battle, and that battle will be stronger with the delay created by the deferment that the US and Saudi secured. This is one example. Maersk Line is a big Danish ship owner. They've ordered about 20 methanol dual-fuel ships. That's a collective investment of about $10 billion. So they're wedded to methanol, whether they like it or not. And so our argument, which is that there is no competitive future for methanol, is a challenge to them, which we regularly clash about. Similarly, the biofuels lobby has a large amount of capital already sunk in their production processes, but also expecting to do more investment. So Brazil, as one example, is busy in Belém telling everyone that biofuel has a key role to play, and they expect to unlock a further $20 billion of investment into their economy for production of biofuels. They will be arguing against us in this next period. And we already have a strong argument against us from the LNG lobby that reared its head over the summer this year in particular. Here is one example. This is an export terminal in Louisiana. It's one plant or one facility that costs, again, about $10 billion. And that is a facility that will want to make money over the next 20 years, and they will want to sell LNG, including to ships. And so we face a battle, we face a very disruptive 10 years where these will all play out, and we'll see whether or not there's anyone who wins. But in the meantime, here's a reference to the Pacific again, because whilst we've been obsessing with how to win that battle, they've been busy building ships that work in their particular circumstances. Just as there are horses for courses, there are also ships for courses, and in this case, Juranai is a wind-assisted vessel that is an ideal solution for operating in between the islands in the Pacific. So there's work that I think we could do better in terms of how we think about the vessels and the technologies that are appropriate for different countries. There's just a small quote here from Doreen de Brum, who's Tony de Brum's daughter, who carries on some of that work and was articulate in explaining why they felt the need to do this whilst everything was going wrong around them. So the other element that I think there is still lots of work to do is to do with this problem of the unclear economic risk and opportunity at the individual country level. If we regulate shipping, if we tax its emissions or find some other way to force the change to a more expensive fuel, the consequence that we can expect, as we did in our work with UNCTAD last year, is for having major negative effects on several countries, but particularly low-income countries. So with apologies to anyone who lives in an island, because this map is obviously not characterising what's happening in lots of the small island developing states, but you can see how an increase in shipping, even under a policy that doesn't have any credit trading, doesn't have any carbon price, just credit trading, we would do some significant GDP impacts, particularly in low-income countries in Africa, very visibly here, but also Latin America and Asia as well. That was something that the Pacific Islands countries were well aware of, and was one of the reasons why they were advocating for this alternative approach of a levy that we saw lost in the battle earlier this year. But that concept would have generated centralised funds that could be given back to countries, not just Africa as that arrow implies, but just to show you how that can actually turn countries that would be negatively impacted into countries that would see a net positive circumstance, a gain in GDP as a consequence of the regulation. So there is a story that you can tell here, but it relies on redistribution, which is not an easy story to tell. In essence, what we saw effectively both in April but also in October this year was that governments had to consider this trade-off. On the one hand, they knew that any regulation, whatever its design, was going to increase their costs. And that was something that they were hoping would be less than the uncertain revenue, the potential benefits they would get from that mechanism of giving the funds back to them, and the potential uncertain and avoided environmental costs. That's greyed out because actually the IMO took that off the table in its evaluation. The only thing we were allowed to talk about, having agreed the parameters, was the negative economic cost versus the uncertain revenue that they might receive. And it was a battle to get the uncertain revenue in the equation in the first place. But the other element of why this is so difficult is because the economic cost is always something that people visualise now. Our costs are going to be increased by 10% tomorrow, whereas the benefit, the future revenue, is something that is only in the future and therefore is easily discounted to being a very low positive. And that's why, with a relatively small negative added from the Trump threats in some cases, or a strong one in many cases, it's easy to reverse that equation to one where instead of it being the case that the economic costs were less, it turns out that the downsides were more in many countries' decision-making than the upsides that they could see. So we have to work more to see if we can solidify some of the terms in that equation and find countries an ability to take a more positive decision. But all of that has to be done within the context of the quality of data, particularly the quality of data in the least income countries, the lowest income countries. And here are some photos taken by my colleague James, who's done a lot of work on this with Pete and Maria and others at MCST over the last few years, to try and look at the data gathering processes. This is the Marshall Islands again. Here is data gathering in the Marshall Islands on something which in many other countries, in Europe and the UK, would be fully automated customs registries. Here it's information that could be easily wiped off by accident and then gives you all sorts of problems with the quality. So we need to come up with not just something which is a better equation, but also better data at the same time. So that's my setting out the stall to respond a bit to Jackie's offer of me using this to kind of explain where I see important work still needing to be done. this was something that I expressed earlier this year. I think actually it was in challenge to Richard or Declan, who are at the back of the room here, who wrote something about it being boring at the IMO. And I kind of responded to that by saying, actually, the IMO itself is this riveting mix of geopolitics and local politics, of hope and despair, of self-interest and empathy, of science and lobbying, of colourful captains and technocrats, and if you go on the right day, as John showed us, of dance, music and poetry. And for those who were here at the opening, I was playing a little bit of John Turnerdo performing a couple of Bob Marley songs, which is one of the ways in which he's helped to create a bit of cultural sort of presence within the basement of a Hyatt hotel in Vauxhall, which is where they have to undertake their preparation for these types of negotiations. But those performances have continued and given this clear signal to the IMO that this is a community which is here despite the fact that they don't have the capacity or the resources like the rest of us to do what it takes to lead. So our research group is keen to see the future as an opportunity to help those who have that sort of political will to continue to support them in whatever way they need, but also to work for those who are still not convinced what the future might look like in terms of both an economic opportunity but also a technology. But I need to go back to Harry Potter, otherwise that would be a kind of lazy metaphor to have used. And this is a rather gruesome picture of Voldemort, or a tiny part of Voldemort that was actually within Harry Potter and was the last Horcrux, or sorry, the penultimate to be correct, Horcrux, is that right, Fergus? Penultimate Horcrux that was destroyed, and it was destroyed by Harry having to die in order for it to be extracted from his body. This is very gruesome, sorry. But I hope that this is something that everyone's quite familiar with, so it's relatively easy for me to carry that. So, but my point here is that there has been a lot written about the net zero framework because of the deferment and because of the tactics that were used by those governments, US and Saudi in particular, is dead. And I would like to point to this story as a reason to say, well, it's not actually. Maybe what it needed was to get to that point in order for people to realise what it was and what it is therefore representing as a significant hope for a driver of change across this industry, but actually more generally, including in a lot of low-income countries where there is no obvious other driver for either the mitigation or the adaptation action, which we know is so critically needed. So there's a message of hope here that actually, once we've now expunged this final part of Voldemort, maybe we'll be able to adopt it in the near future. But that is how I wanted to, that gruesome picture is how I wanted to conclude. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving me a chance to waffle on for 40 minutes. And I better pass to Harry, but I'll leave to Jackie to introduce.
Fabulous. Tristan, thank you very much indeed. I genuinely wasn't expecting Harry Potter this evening, so that was a pleasant surprise. Harry has kindly joined us today, Dr. Harry Conway. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Obviously, the relationship that you have, the working relationship that you have with Tristan is going to come across very much in what you're going to say, but we can see then, here we have this tremendous relationship of academia working alongside, being part of the IMO. This is a very rich relationship, it's powerful. Harry, it's almost 20 years since you became part of the Liberian delegation to the IMO, and you are the alternate permanent representative of Liberia and chair of the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO. And as we've seen from the images that Tristan has showed, some challenging conversations I imagine you will have had over your years. You've done a tremendous amount of work in your role, advocacy, negotiation, and I imagine a lot of conciliatory work as well. Harry, it would be lovely to hear from you now. You are the discussant. There's plenty for you to discuss, including Harry Potter, should you wish to do so. Folks, please welcome Dr. Harry Conway.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Tristan. And It's a pleasure to be here. And when Tristan contacted me to come and be his discussant, given that we had just come from a very, tough, extraordinary session, so probably he thought maybe this won't be the best time to contact Harry. Harry needed to rest and reflect on what has just happened. But I told Tristan, I thought this is I think it presents a good opportunity to come and let's start discussing the issues. We're not going to run from the discussions, So I listened to Tristan's presentation, which I think was great. And I'd like to give what I think actually happened and where I think we are headed to, and what role academia can play, and of course what role environmentalists can play, what role member states can play. And at the end of the day, I think what's going to happen, eventually there will be adoption, but for that to happen, there has to be some hard conversations. We have to talk to one another, listen to one another, and see where we can make compromises, build consensus, collaborate, cooperate, and of course, demonstration level of commitment to achieve what we refer to as regulatory clarity. With that said, now I come to Tristan's presentation. Maybe for those who don't, Tristan was discussing it in a more technical, maybe too technical for probably because he's an engineer or something. So probably, so let me bring it to the policy perspective. All right. So, and I usually like to firstly give context. Why is IMO all of a sudden talking about GHG reduction in international shipping? Post-Paris 2015, even though shipping wasn't mentioned in the agreement, they were also requested to, people thought it is about time that something should happen in shipping. They should do their fair share to reduce CO2 emission from the sector. Based on that, we adopted what we call the initial strategy in 2018. One thing that happened during that period, which didn't happen at the extraordinary session, I remember when we are entering the building, at that time I was the vice chair of the committee. When we are entering the building, there were protesters at the front of the IMO building. You find it difficult, delegates find it difficult to even enter the hall. All right? So what I'm trying to say is that the reason why IMO is getting involved is the CO2 challenge or the CO2 crisis or the climate crisis is real. We want to ensure that we do not breach that 1.5 degrees C CO2 limit. So shipping, even though most times we hear that its contribution is just 3% of the global emissions, however, the rate of emission as it increases is something that we needed to put a handle on. Based on that, we adopted the initial strategy. But now the initial strategy was to decarbonize the sector by the end of the century. Come the IPCC report, fifth assessment report, that thought that we were at the precipice. So shipping, so we had to revise the strategy in 2023, and we adopted the IMO 2023 GHG strategy unanimously. I want to add the word unanimously. It's critical. Unanimously was adopted in 2023. All right. Post-adoption, now we have to put in place measures. First, we started with short-term measures, carbon intensity indicator, CII, you may hear, and EEDSR, that have to do with ship design. Now comes the big one, midterm measures, to ensure that this revised strategy that aims to decarbonize the sector by 2050, near or by 2050, with indicative checkpoints, 2030. By 2030, we want alternative fuels to be 5 to 10% in shipping. Then you come 2040, targets, and then 2050, we want net zero CO2 emission from shipping. How do we do that? All these measures. That's what the discussion has been all about. You saw Tristan giving you all these graphs. But the challenge has been the issue about why we don't carry on these discussions, the issue of impact on states and impact on fleets. So we commissioned a study, what we call a comprehensive impact assessment. The World Maritime University, UNCTAD, and others. So the one on fleet was done, the one on impact on states was done. But the ones done on states, you noted that countries were aggregated. So it was kind of bundling of countries, and so you weren't in a position to appreciate what the impact would be on an individual level. So that in itself was a challenge. Then, of course, you have petrol states, or countries that are fossil fuel dependent. So most times as chair, I tell people I sit between two groups of people. I have what I call high ambition. You have small island developing states. These people existence is threatened. If we don't do anything about CO2, they will not exist. Sea level rise tomorrow, they won't exist. Just last week or the week before, the storm in Jamaica or across the Caribbean speaks for itself. The flood across Philippines speaks for itself. So you have these countries, the states, as we call them, that have ambition. So they push, as you heard him saying, they were talking about level as much as $300 per ton of CO2 emitted they were aiming for. Though they didn't get that anyway. At the other end of the spectrum, you have what I call the cautious approach. These people, they do recognize the threat of climate change and whatnot, but because their economy is disproportionately dependent on fossil fuel. So okay, yeah, we agree, but I mean, let's take it easy how we proceed. Let's proceed cautiously. All right. So these are two groups of people we are dealing with. So how do we solve this big challenge? That's why you heard Tristan show a picture where you heard that there was some total commotion in the hall when we tried to adopt the net zero framework. It's about negotiation, it's about compromises. Bear in mind you are dealing with 176 countries. Different national circumstances. And for shipping, it becomes challenging because shipping operates on the policy of no more favorable treatment. So in other words, when we say no more favorable treatment, the principle of no more favorable treatment is that all ships must meet certain standards. You can't lower safety standard because the person that owned the ship or the ship came from maybe a developing country or a developed country. No. All ship, if there's a regulation, it's applied globally. That no more favorable treatment versus CBDR, come up with differentiated responsibility and national circumstances. On the other hand, somebody is telling, oh yeah, you are more endowed than I am. You have more capacity than I am. So the policy, the strategy recognizes these things. So quite correctly, as Tristan captured in his discussion, he saw the states, as he said, they pushed, they negotiated very strongly to get us to where we are. But I can tell you how to take compromises. Without compromises, we won't have adopted the strategy unanimously, let alone even approve the framework. We have approved the net zero framework. The votes during approval was 63 in favor, 24 abstention, 16 against. That was approval. I want Tristan of UN Academia to do a kind of deep dive of the votes during approval and the votes during deferral. During deferral, 59 countries say we should defer. 47 say no, we should not. And 21 abstain. So the question I'm asking myself, and which also goes to Tristan, which we call for further research, because in his presentation he talked about of course we saw that as it's captured in the paper, the U.S. Tactics of, bullying, as he reflected, may have contributed to the outcome. That's a likelihood, that's possible. But I also want you in academia to take another lens as well. Why that is possible, but how come if you take a look at the voting, those that say yes, if you take a look, this is a list, it's an IMO document, it's publicly available, so you can have it. It's an INF document, INF 2.4, so you see countries that voted yes, countries that voted no. The thing is, countries that voted to defer, why would about 14 countries, because if 64 countries approved, right, how come adoption dropped to 49? Those countries that switched position, some of them, the U.S. cannot bully them. I can tell you for sure, the U.S. cannot bully some of those countries. So the question becomes, why did they switch their position? Could the U.S. tactics have been presented them an opportunity to do what they actually wanted to do? So that brings me to the issue of, as I see it, everything boils down to economics, national interest. That's the driving factor in what you see happening. So for academia and the environmentalists that I will come to later that tend to have dropped the ball, they dropped the ball because, as I said, when we came for the approval, I didn't see the usual pressure that they mounted on us when we were trying to craft the policy. Because probably everybody had assumed that adoption would have just sailed through. But that didn't happen. So since economics is critical, then I think what academia can do to help the policymakers at the IMO, and Tristan talked about the LEAP project, which is leading effective Afrocentric participation in the IMO discussion. By the way, that study, they did about 6 case studies in African countries, where those countries could now look at their trading routes. What are the trading routes by ship? What are the major primary commodities they are shipping? And if there's a transition or there's some increase in the cost of shipping, what will be the impact on their economy? And the results are startling. So academia, why it may not be academically feasible to do 176 countries, because I can tell you it takes a lot of effort and work, but you can select a kind of acceptable sample size, probably from LDC, SAGES, and developing countries, and see how you can analyze those countries as well, the economic impact, and take a look at those aspects that the IMO study didn't consider. That will help to also enlighten why probably the deferral took place, and not only because the U.S. may have threatened people. All right, yes, they did call, they may have threatened, but that alone may not have helped. That's number one. Number two, the IMO operates on what we call evidence-based policy making. As a matter of fact, we pride ourselves as the most efficient UN agency. Why? Because UN meetings, if you go to UNFCCC, is bogged down with unnecessary politics and bureaucracy. Yes, we have that IMO, but at least at IMO, because as you could see, Tristan was showing you the technical numbers, the graphs and what have you. Because we send our proposals to drafting or working groups, they discuss it, the technician, they give the evidence. Why politics is important, but you need to convince your fellow colleague or member states why you think your data or your evidence is solid and we should adopt that. That brings into the environmentalist. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the science has proven that the changes in our weather pattern we are at the precipice. Wildfires, storm, tornado. Here in the UK, I know about a month or so ago, I was somewhere out of the UK, but I was watching television. And when I watched the television, the farmers here, because they're already experiencing drought, the potato harvests are damaged. They could not harvest. What I'm saying is now, it boils down to we do make policies at the IMO, but the policy we are making is influenced by domestic politics. So don't make a mistake to think because we are the IMO, we are not. As a matter of fact, most of the delegates, when they are speaking to domestic audience. They are not talking to those who are in the hall. They are speaking to their domestic audience. They want to show to the domestic audience, oh, I was there, this is what I advocated for. What I'm trying to say is, if you want to get things done at the IMO, you have to mount the pressure from the local people domestically. That's where the pressure should come from. If a country is experiencing drought, and this guy will use my country, Liberia, as a case study. As a matter of fact, my country is host to the Upper Guinea Forest. 40% of Upper Guinea Forest in Liberia, which is like a kind of carbon lungs. But that is also been threatened by deforestation and what have you. And of course, sea level rise and erosion is threatening my capital city. The biggest referral hospital, John F. Kennedy Medical Center, the perimeter fence is already in the ocean. One of the biggest high schools in the city is already virtually gone by the ocean. So, what I'm driving at is the science has shown that if we don't take action, tomorrow we will not exist. So the environmentalists that I said, drop the ball. These sciences, you need to show that to your politicians home, locally, and tell them that this is the situation, so we need to act. And strangely enough, why the IMO, we broke from the extraordinary session, defer it. On the 28th of October, the President of the Republic of Liberia signed an Executive Order 155 establishing the National Carbon Authority Registry to track CO2 emissions, to see which sector is doing what, an authority. So that's a contradiction from the position Liberia took to defer. But here you see back home what happened. So what I'm saying is if the facts and evidence are presented to the people back home, the politicians back home, who sent, because the delegates come from capital. When you are talking to people, they say, oh, I have to consult my capital. It's a common language you hear in the IMO. I will consult the capital. If the domestic audience see the threat of climate change and think that shipping should play its part and contribute its fair share, those are the IMO. No matter how much threat from whichever place, you will not be able to ride over 177 member states. That won't happen. The science will speak for itself. Even those that will be threatening, they themselves will have domestic audience to deal with. So in a nutshell, from what I can say, Tristan study, yes, it's good, but they need to now take it a step further. They need to wear not so much the environmentalist hat. They need to think in the context of economics, because it's the primary driving force behind everything you see. As a matter of fact, the whole net zero framework, or the issue of carbon capture or storage that he was talking about, the issue of alternative fuels, he's using e-fuel, but those are different fuels. He's talking about those are investor interests combating one another and what have you. It's all economics. Because some people have already invested. So what become of their investment? So if the policy was to scuttle their investment, and they could find a way to talk to somebody who will help them to make sure their investment don't go down the drain, they will talk to those people. So everything you see happening is economics. It's people trying to protect their interests. But industry, why industry may not be a good champion, is because they are competing among themselves. They won't give you their secrets, no matter what you do. Those are trade secrets. They have it. They want to be ahead of the curve. Everybody wants to be ahead of the curve. They try to say they blame the IMO. Oh, we need regulatory clarity. Why they are saying they need regulatory clarity, but they will also not give us the kind of data that will help us to give us the regulatory clarity. Why? Which is understandable. Because you don't want your competitor going ahead of you. That's where the academia that is not restricted by what's happening in industry comes into the picture. You can do an independent study that can advise policymakers on how best to proceed. Environmentalists are the gatekeepers. They have to keep government feet to the fire. They are the gatekeepers. They drop the ball, they need to pick up the ball. And as I say, while we are negotiating at the IMO, as I tell people, no matter how, if we want to delay in the negotiations, fine. If we don't want to adopt, fine. But nature is not negotiating. Nature is not negotiating. The fires, the floods, everywhere have been decimated. So we have a hard choice to make. Do we protect future generations, or do we do something? What I'm saying is shaping people. People tend to make, there's a tunnel vision. People are looking, oh, it's shaping. Shipping is just a subset of the entire climate discussion, just one little sector. So that's what would be my take on the presentation of Tristan. I mean, we can have the discussion and take questions and as we go about. Okay?
I can't move it on to the last slide, but we've got a few minutes. There is a reception shortly, which is not a threat to people who keep asking questions, but there should be a reward eventually. But I'm very grateful to Harry for giving a response to that. I mean, as he acknowledged, he's had an extraordinary experience over certainly the last 2 months in the preparation to that meeting, and I hope that between us we can give you some interesting remarks and any further questions. We'll do this fairly informally. If anyone has a question, please put your hand up and we'll come and feel free to say who you want to answer it, or if both of us then both.
Regards to the voting at the IMO for the next vote, is there anything that can be done to provide safe haven for the small nations that have been bullied in submission? And the second question is there any chance of anonymous vote next time?
All right, yes. In terms of bullying and providing safe haven, what I think can be done is, as I was talking to Tristan, those that may be doing the bullying or something, the best way to counter such action is to have the evidence before you, right? So I was telling Tristan, I said, for example, if a country did its own impact assessment on potential measures on their country, and you have this hard data, how your country is going to be impacted if nothing is done, and someone comes to threaten you to go another way, you will be in a position to tell this person, say, look, this is what is happening to my country. This is what is happening to me. And this is what I want to address. If you think I should go this way, then give me a better solution. If you don't have a better solution, then this is how I will go. And I think with such hard facts and hard data, you'll be able to keep away those that are bullying. In other words, there should be a quid pro quo. So if you want me to follow you, then you have to find a way of mitigating the impact of this negative CO2 emission on my country. If you don't have that solution, then there's no way I'm going to follow you. But the challenge most of those faced was that, especially for the politicians, look at it. I'm from a developed country. They don't have the facts, right? They don't know the facts. They don't know the science. So somebody calls above you. He calls above a delegate, calls the capital, and the politician who is answering doesn't have an idea of how his own country is even being impacted by this climate crisis. So what needs to be done to give these countries safe haven? That's where people like Tristan or the academia and environmentalists come in. Help them to see the picture of what inaction will cost them in the long run. Yes, in the short run, this person may do this and that, but if you don't protect your own interests now, eventually you may have a situation whatever you think you are trying to protect may not exist. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I like to use Nigeria as a case study. Nigeria is a fossil fuel dependent country. 90% of the budget is dependent on fossil fuel, right? But equally so, they have vast potential for alternative fuel and renewable energy and what have you. Just the end of last year, there was massive flood in Maiduguri. A dam burst and cities flooded, people lost their lives, properties destroyed. So the question now to countries like Nigeria is, yes, you are fossil fuel dependent in the short run, but in the long run, you cannot protect this asset. The best way to protect this asset is to start diversifying into this area. I'm sure if academia and environmentalists can make the case to policymakers, you will have, even the country is dependent on fossil, they will start having a rethink and moving in a totally different direction. I follow up on, I'm following up the COP discussion, COP 30, and the UN chief for the climate conference was saying that Texas, USA, you know, that's one of the biggest oil producers, right? Texas. But I was shocked to learn that 40% of the households is powered by solar. 40%. That's significant. Pakistan renewable potential, they are the highest. CNN just reported renewable potential. Pakistan, 30% renewable energy potential. So in other words, what I'm saying is, forget the delay that happened at the IMO, forget the deferral. People are already investing in into alternative fuels and alternative ways of reducing CO2 emission. So those countries that have been bullied or whatnot, that's the picture you need to show them. And I'm sure if the leaders see those pictures, they will make independent decisions.
I like Harry's optimism in the science. That's reassuring to me, but I think there are two answers I would give you. One is that there are codes of conduct at the IMO that I think were transgressed, but I don't really understand how there's an enforcement action to punish the United States, amongst others, who are breaching the code of conduct, from what I could tell. So I don't know whether that's a failing, and I think more work needs to be done on that. And the other thing I would say is this: there are potential changes to the voting system. So you alluded to the idea of a secret ballot, which I've heard being suggested by several people, where you wouldn't then declare your country's position. You would therefore be shielded perhaps from the retribution that is being threatened by the United States, because they wouldn't be able to identify how you actually positioned. I think there will be several people exploring that over this next period. Whether or not there's something that can be done fast enough as a procedural change, I don't know the answer, but we will be looking into that ourselves a little bit, just to understand whether that's an option. I like Harry's optimism, but I also think we need some of these things as well, given what we observed in the last meeting.
Is academia sufficiently represented at the IMO? Well, this case in point, I'm sure that there are a lot of American academics who completely disagreed with the USA position on all of this. And also I know that your input to the IMO is through the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. It's not an academic input, it's a representing a much wider group with a much broader perspective, I guess.
Yeah. Sufficiently represented. I don't know if there is such a thing as sufficient academia. Jackie, do you want to comment on that? I think never enough. Okay, so I think the academics can agree it's insufficiently represented. But I liked Harry's reflections on the role of environmentalists, because I think that's a take that I'd not heard many people have, and I wonder if there's actually, I mean, academia is many different things, or can work in different places, and maybe there's a lot more that could be done in different regions, and that was very much what we were trying to do with the LEAP project. So those are reports that are not written. We didn't write the reports. We worked with the University of Namibia, with the University of Malawi, and so there we were working with in-country academics who were by far better positioned to do exactly what Harry, I think, is expressing is needed, which is countries to be better equipped. And I think there's a huge role for a network of global academics to be putting their outputs into the local context much more effectively than they have been.
On the representation of academia at the IMO, I like to look at it from two perspectives. The Western and probably the developing or probably the African perspective. From the Western perspective, from my experience, the academia plays a significant role from the back. They always do the studies, inform the policy position that you see member states in the West are taking. From my part of the country that I come from, the world I come from, sadly, which has to do with local politics, the politicians tend to be frightened of the academics. They think you want to take their jobs, think you are too smart. So instead of, and this is something we have discussed, we have what we call the Africa Maritime Advisory Group. Even within the LEAP project, we are encouraging our governments to make more use of the universities and the researchers, to include them in the delegations. Don't show them, so you don't come to a meeting blind, you don't know what is being discussed. You go to academia, they have the information, they have the evidence, they can help you to deconstruct the issue and help you craft your policy position and interventions at the meetings. But it's a challenge in my part of the world. We are working on it. We are encouraging our governments, make more use of the academics. I think here in the West, I can give it to them. They do make more use of the academics. As a matter of fact, as chair of MEPC, when I travel, one of the places they always take me to visit are universities. And I see universities are carrying on a lot of research in this whole GHG space. And that's Western academics. Yeah.
Hi, Mike Felt. Thanks very much. to you both for those comments. Kind of picks up on that previous question, so mainly to Tristan, because what your comments there, Harry, were just addressing the end of what I'm going to say, which is that academics can sometimes be positioned on a spectrum from like honest broker to more activist, and you know, whatever you think, it's always going to be subjective. There are always decisions about what to study or not to study, or what to include or not to include, that will probably be to some extent driven by values and ideologies. I guess I just wanted to ask you, Tristan, to reflect a bit on how you come at that in your engagement with the IMO. Is it something that you explicitly consider, and how do you navigate that, and what do you think it means for how your work is perceived?
If I've understood the question, you're saying, is there a strategy to the way that I operate to try and position myself within that spectrum? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think recognising that there is that spectrum,
yeah.
and that you can try and land somewhere, and even if you land at the honest broker end, you're probably going to end up, you know, introducing assumptions or value-based assumptions. But how do you navigate that, I guess?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. Thank you for the question. I think it's a real challenge for academic work to be put into a political environment where you're also putting yourself into that environment. So one way in which we could operate, and we discussed this as a group on a relatively high frequency, is we could step out of the IMO. We could not be in the room at all, and we could write papers, and we could talk about the papers. We could have lectures and offer people opportunities to come and listen to them, but just leave the politics and the process to itself. And that's one way in which we would be disseminating the work, but also leaving that process to itself. We've decided against that because we didn't see that there was a likelihood that if we operated in that way, the work would actually make it into the discussion. And there is, as Harry said, I mean, there are delegates that have academics within the national teams. The Brazilian team makes a great job of using University of Sao Paulo to fight its arguments. And we took a very conscious decision not to join a country delegation, not to join the UK delegation, or not to join any country delegations. At some point, the countries have to make political decisions, and we didn't want to be a mouthpiece for a particular political position. And as your point alluded to, I've joined and put a lot of our research into the debate through the Institute of Marine Engineers, Science and Technologies, which is a professional institution that includes academics alongside industry and other stakeholders within those specializations. So that was the strategic decision, was to go, it's probably better to be in the room, partly because we're not confident that the work would reach there, but also because we want to hear what is going on. This is a two-way dialogue for academia. This is not something where we just want to tell everyone what the answer is. We need to understand the debate, so we need to be in the process a little bit. But then let's choose an NGO that we can work with. But that isn't the only way in which we operate. We also work very closely with countries where they might obviously have a political position, and they will come to us, as Tony de Brum did in 2015, and say, what is it that we need to know in order to go into the IMO? What's the science that is associated with our political position? And that's, again, another minefield of how do you operate in a way that has integrity to make sure that the work you're doing is scientifically robust, but also being, you're not deploying in a way which is lacking in integrity. And all we can do really is make sure and police amongst ourselves. And so we do this between ourselves as a group, and we say, this is what we're going to say to this particular constituency. Is everyone comfortable? Is there a way in which we've crossed a line here of becoming activists because we're so passionate about getting a result? And we try and ask ourselves that and challenge each other constantly within the group. There isn't really a mechanism much beyond that, but there have been confrontations that I've had with political actors where they've basically told me I crossed a line, in which case I then go back and think very carefully about whether that's true or whether they were saying that to me because I was unhelpful to the political objective they were trying to achieve. And so, I don't take it as face value that someone tells me I've crossed a line. I just go back and talk to other people and say, what do you think of that assessment? So that, it's a constant minefield, but I think it's a natural course of action if we're going to get any of the evidence into the right parts of the discussion. I hope that.
And talking about, I'd like to add to that. I think it boils down to the issue of positionality. But you are academics, and no matter what you do, people will still have. You come with certain background, you come with certain perceptions and whatnot. So, because I have people have some delegates come up to me and think that probably the certain study was biased because the person that produced the study think the person is from this part of the world. So we think it's not. We have our own study. So basically, what I'm trying to say in academia, especially in the IMO setting, all I can say ensure that it is scientifically robust. Because if you think no matter what you do, people still read in suspicion. I can tell you for sure, they still read in that suspicion. Tristan, where is he from? And they think he's promoting somebody else's interest, or who's sponsoring him. These are the kind of questions you keep hearing, all that kind of stuff. So most importantly, ensure that your research is robust, scientifically sound. Definitely you cannot avoid the issue of positionality in research, academic research. You know, it will always be there. People always have their views. But ensure that you are not biased and all the ethical boxes are ticked.
We've got one more question, I think. Thank you.
Sorry, can we have two? One at the back and the front. But after that.
Okay, I'll be quick. My name's Liz May. I work at the LSE Feroz Lalji Institute for Africa. This has been a fascinating discussion. As a case study of influence and how it works in these multilateral settings and what that might mean for COP and the WTO and those other things, the whole thing's kind of fascinating to me from that perspective. But Harry, you talked about the need for this more kind of granular impact work, understanding, really what this is going to mean for, particularly for developing countries, least developed countries. But the reality is that for some countries, the costs are going to be too much. It's not in their interest to proceed with this, and I think we mustn't kind of be naive about that. A lot of the studies, and you talked about the LEAP studies, and I've been going through them, they do show that, significant impacts for countries who are dependent on shipping for their exports, for their imports, for their industrialization efforts. And, as Tristan, as you said, the benefits are kind of in the future, they're intangible, they're really hard to pin down, they won't come to every country by any means. So my question is, I know you mentioned that the CBDR principle doesn't apply at the IMO, but was there and is there potential for kind of either some kind of exemptions for countries where it's too difficult, or, at the WTO, which I know much better, you have special and differential treatment for LDCs in other countries. So I'm just curious to what extent, I'm sure it was, but to understand how that was explored and why that isn't a possibility, because I think it might be a way to bring more countries eventually on side, but addressing their kind of very legitimate, in some cases, concerns.
When I say at the IMO we have it's the principle of CBDR versus no more favorable treatment. So the strategy, the very strategy we are talking about, the IMO GHG strategy, recognizes that. It takes that into consideration. That's why we are doing the impact assessment on SITs and what have you, taking into consideration the respective national circumstances. However, what I'm saying is, in shipping, especially on the vessel, when it comes to the vessel itself, that ship, we would not reduce the safety standard of the vessel because you are from a country that is, struggling in terms of CBDR. No, the standard will still be the same. So whatever policy that is adopted, we apply evenly on that vessel. No, they're not going to say, okay, because maybe Liberia, your GDP is this, so this vessel, no, it remains the same. Talking about cost in terms of doing studies, I would think that the country can do those studies. It's a matter of national prioritization. They have the money in the budget. It's there. Prioritize it. It's a matter of prioritization. What do you prioritize in the budget? Do you want a four-wheel drive SUV, somebody driving some four-wheel drive SUV, or do you want to do a study that way benefit your country in the long run? So for me, I think those studies can be done. Other industry can support it. The country itself can look in its national budget and find the money to support the study. And it's a matter of whether they consider it a national priority. That's how I see it. Yeah.
There's a much, your question deserves a much longer response, but just to say that there were a lot of low-income countries that rejected the concept of an exemption. So exemptions were discussed as part of the run-up to the April negotiations. They were on the table, and they were rejected by low-income countries who said, frankly, we don't want to be left behind, because the consequence of an exemption is that all of the 40-year-old dirty ships will be put on our routes, and we will be technologically inferior, whilst the West, or whoever is not exempt, gets all the new technology. And we want the opportunity for investment as much as the West does. Can we have one at the back and then... Sorry?
Sorry to be the last one. First of all, just want to say thank you for such a clear explanation of what is an unfeasibly complicated history that I have sat through alongside you, and it was an insightful version of events. So thank you both, and Harry, thank you. I guess I wanted to ask, how far were you caught off guard? Because it's amazing how many people have retrospectively told me that they absolutely knew the vote was going to go the way it went after the event. But I think the reality is most people in the room were caught off guard. Yeah. We talk about the fact that these countries are homogenous in their view. They're not. Liberia, for example, Harry, voted alongside the US. You have the largest flag state in the world in Liberia, based in Virginia, just down the road from the CIA. Marshall Islands, who you mentioned, also second largest flag state in the world. Existential crisis, also second largest flag state in the world, based in Virginia, just down the road from the CIA. My point being that there is divisions within divisions here. Even the UGS, the Union of Greek Ship Owners, are now overtly divided in terms of what we do. The question, I guess, is how far do we open up this box now? We were looking at a binary decision. That didn't work. How far back do you think we now need to take this compromise that you talk about so eloquently? How much do we have to reopen in order to get where you want to go?
Yeah, we're trying to get to the reception, Richard.
Okay, talking about reopening the IMO's matter of work. Usually, once we have a discussion on our agenda item, and a decision is made, we do not just immediately reopen that issue for discussion. So, because I think if you start doing that, you have a situation where there will be no progress. You have every now and then, when a situation arises, or somebody has a concern, you reopen the discussion, and you keep moving in this vicious cycle of running in the sand without motion, without progress. So I don't. What I see happening is when we deferred the discussions, I think there were issue of tacit acceptance, explicit acceptance, depending how much the members discuss about themselves. That could be one of the starting points. Whether you want to have this tacit or explicit acceptance. The good thing about this ongoing discussions at the IMO, we are still discussing the maritime measures, right? So it's still up for discussions. What was different is just the framework was what we just tried to adopt. We didn't adopt this framework, but what's going into this framework, the details, issues that should go inside it, stay on the side. So countries still have the opportunities to put across their concerns and see how well the concerns are taken into consideration based on compromises. But to think that, for example, we have approved this framework and we'll just go back to another session and reopen the entire discussion, I don't see that happening. Yeah.
I think I can confess to being caught off guard. And I think you know that because obviously we saw each other during the week. But I did write a paper on the Sunday before the MEPC extraordinary session because I saw the biggest risk during the week was a 12-month deferment that was being brought in. So that was the point where it really crystallised for me. But before that Sunday, I was not expecting it to be as brutal as it was. And even on the Sunday, as I wrote that paper, I thought I was writing it as a, like, just to make sure we've dotted all the I's paper, not this is something we're going to really need. So that paper was in our networks from that Sunday afternoon onwards, but it wasn't enough. But yeah, lots of people who definitely have said that they saw it coming, which is interesting. Thank you so much. I better pass back to Jackie because...
Great, I will not keep you terribly long. Thank you so much for this evening. Harry, you said nature is not negotiating, and that really is going to stay with me. We've heard Tristan talk about the importance of a really strong research base, the influence that it can have to great policy making. This is a challenging area to work in. We've heard a call to action. We've also had a call to examine what happens about inaction, and I think that's really important. So Tristan Smith, Harry Conway, thank you so much. Congratulations to you. Good evening.